Hey, Dave Frary here. Welcome to this edition of the Trackside Modeler. In this video, we're going to build model railroad scenery from start to finish. We're going to start by building the basic landforms, add rocks, paint them, add foliage, trees, roads, ballast the track, and then finish the scene. So let's get started. Here's our little model railroad that we're building. It doesn't look like much right now, but by the time we finish this video, you'll see it fully scenic. What I've done, I've laid foam. This is 2-inch thick foam, and I've added some ON30 track, flex track, and the flex track is just held down on the foam with liquid nails. And we'll talk a little bit about liquid nails in a minute. But first, I want to talk about the simplest, quickest, and easiest way to build scenic forms, and that's to use cardboard strips. The strips are quick to install, and they're easy to change. For this demonstration, I'll be using these Micromark corrugated cardboard strips. They're pre-cut, so all you have to do is separate them from each other, and the package will cover a very large area. So all I'm going to do now is take these strips. You can see there's a lot of them in this package. They'll cover quite a large area of your model railroad. We're going to take them and we're just going to separate them from the die cutting. And we can use all of this stuff. I mean, just because the pieces are on the edge doesn't mean that they're no good. We'll use every scrap of this. So here's our strip. It's about 1 inch wide, and it's sturdy enough and long enough to start building scenery. And building the scenery is, especially with these strips, is really easy. And that's what we're going to do next. Well, let's start by deciding where our landforms are going to go. I'm going to build a mountain here, and it's going to start in the front. And there'll be a tunnel portal right here. And I'm thinking of making it a rock tunnel portal. I know it's close to the front edge of the railroad, but I think it'll be effective because it'll be a nice viewing angle. When you look down from this side, you'll see this nice rock blasted tunnel portal. The mountain will come down this way and it'll kind of tail off towards the back of the layout. I'm going to build a stream coming from this little bridge down, and it'll trickle out of sight down in the back here. So once we have a little plan, it's easy to start. And you only need a few tools for using cardboard strips. One is a hot glue gun. This is kind of a sad looking example, but it's an inexpensive little gun I got at a craft store. It was about $4. And I've been using it for years and it works just great. It uses low melt glue sticks, and these are very forgiving, especially if you get a blob of glue on your finger, you won't burn it. The next item, of course, is a regular staple gun, and we're going to use this for fastening the strips to the foam along with a good squirt of hot glue. Last but not least is a clamp type staple gun, and these are important for joining the pieces together. I'm going to start by adding pieces on the back side of the track. Now we're going to have a tunnel portal here, as I mentioned. It'll be right in here. So what we have to do before we build a lot of scenery, we have to ballast the track in here and add some gravel and some dirt, and we should add a tunnel liner. But first, what I'm going to do is put the scenery up against where the tunnel portal will be. And you see I've taken just the piece of corrugated cardboard. I've put a little dollop of glue on it, and now I'm going to just stick it in place. And we're going to put it right here, close to the line. And to hold it temporarily, we'll put a staple in it. Let's go with another one. It'll be right behind it. Again, a little dab of hot glue. We push the piece in place and hit it with the staple gun. Now people may ask, how far do you put these apart? Well, I like to put them the width of my hand. So I'm going to go along here and I'm going to put all these base pieces in, and you can see how fast this goes, almost as fast as you can move. And so here's the start of our mountain right here. Now we're going to need some cross pieces. What we're going to do now is add a strip across the front, and that will be at about this height right here. And for that we use the clamp type stapler that I've shown you, and it's kind of simple. You just find where you want to be, which is right there, and you staple it off. Now you can't make a mistake with this stuff because it's all changeable. You just take out the cardboard strips and add some new ones in a different position. The next thing I'm going to do here is add a piece across the back, and I think I know where that's going to be. It's going to be about up here someplace. So what I'm going to do is add a piece to try to tie all these together, and then we'll add pieces in the middle. And once I get them all tied together, then I can put a support under here to temporarily hold them up in this position. I'm going to put a piece across the middle here just to hold it all so they'll all tie together. This is almost like basket weaving. So here we go. This is about how high I want it, right here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take another piece of cardboard. I'm going to put a little foot on it. This is just temporary. And its job is going to be to hold this all right here. Okay, we've added a piece across the top. I'm going to put another piece right here just for strength. You can see how fast this goes. I mean, you could make scenery almost as fast as you can move doing this. What I've done, I've finished the cardboard mountain, and as you can see, I've brought this back edge down a little bit. I cut out the foam in the foreground here to create a bed for the river, and we'll talk a lot more about that later, and we'll show you how we're going to make it. But I did cut the foam away, and I put in all of the mountain pieces. I added a little jog right here just for some interest along the edge of the river. I want to show you the area I left for the tunnel portal here, and I also want to show you this Micromark ON30 clearance gauge. And this gauge is a great tool when you're putting in something like a tunnel portal or structures beside the track, and you want to find out exactly how much clearance you're going to need. I'm going to use this as a clearance gauge to make a tunnel liner, but before I do that, I'm going to ballast the track. We're not going to have any other time to get in here, to get at the track, so I'm going to ballast it now, and then I'm going to finish this edge. This is a section of the layout, and this piece of track here is going to be added onto, and the next section is going to abut it. So don't think that I'm just leaving this track dead-ended under a mountain. Before we ballast the track, we should color the rail and the ties. And to do this, I'm going to use the new Floquil paint pens. These pens are sold in a variety of colors. I'm using the track colors here, which includes rail brown, rail tie brown, and rust. And the nice thing about these are like magic markers, only they have real Floquil paint in them. So you shake it up, you load the tip with paint, and as you can see here, you just paint it onto the rails and the ties. I'm going to run it on both inside and outside of the rail. And this is real paint, so it's a permanent color. For the ties, I'm using the rail tie brown, which is a little darker color. And you don't have to be too precision with this because the ties are already molded brown plastic. So all we're doing is killing the shine a little bit and adding a little color to the ties. And I'm going to finish by taking a little rust, adding it on the spike heads, and putting a little here and there on the inside of the rail just for a variety of color. I want to show you how I like to ballast track. I know there are a lot of ways to do it, and everyone has their own technique, but here's the way I like to do it. First, let's talk about the materials I'm going to use. This is Woodland Scenic's Gray Blend Medium Ballast. And since I'm going to demonstrate ballasting on ON30 track, this is the perfect ballast for it. It's the right size. Second, we're going to use the Woodland Scenic Cement. This is a dilute acrylic cement, and it's very, very good for track ballasting. We're going to apply some moisture, some water, wet water, with the Woodland Scenic's sprayer. And to apply the cement, I'm going to use this Micromark applicator. It's like a syringe, and it's got a hollow tube on the end, and you use it like a little pump. You fill it with glue and then squeeze it between the rails. Also, for some kinds of ballast, instead of using wet water to wet down the ballast, you may need to use 70% rubbing alcohol. This is especially important if you're using really fine ballast in HO or N scale. Okay, I'm going to start by applying some ballast to the track. This is a piece of ON30 track that has been painted. The ties have been painted, the rail has been painted, and I've dry brushed the ties just so that they show the wood grain a little bit. So I've put some of the ballast in a spoon, and I'm just going to spread it between the rail. You don't need a lot of it, just enough to fill up between the rail, and a little on either side. And I'm going to take some of this and put it on the outside because I put too much in here. Okay, we don't have to be too fussy with this right now. It looks really messy. So what I'm going to do to spread the ballast, everybody has their favorite way to spread ballast. Mine is to use a piece of black foam rubber. This is the rubber that comes inside the box when you buy an ON30 engine or boxcar. Something from the Bachmann line. It's a black, soft plastic, and I've cut the piece out of the box padding, and it's the right thickness to go between HO and ON30 track. And all I'm going to do with it is put it between the rails and push it along. And as you can see, it moves the ballast off the tie tops and smooths it out very nicely. Now I'm going to take it again and I'm going to do the outside of the track, and I'm doing the same thing. I'm just running it along the tie top. There, now we have the ballast where we want it. As you can see, there's some excess ballast out here, and I'm just going to push it with the rubber up, smooth it out. There. Now normally I would ballast the track last, but since we have a tunnel portal here, we have to do the ballasting inside the portal, the part that you can see. We have to do that now before we cover up our mountain. Now I can use the Woodland Scenic sprayer, and I can wet down the ballast and get it ready for glue. And what the wetting does, it reduces the surface tension and allows the glue to penetrate into the ballast and hold it in place. Now, if we were using really fine ballast, I would use some of this alcohol, and the alcohol is a wonderful wetting agent. And I would wet down the track and the ballast with the alcohol. And what the alcohol does, it allows the glue to flow better over the ballast. So now we take some of the glue, some of the ballast cement, and we squeeze it in between the rails enough so that it flows out to the edges. You can see that it's seeped out here and it's flowed out onto the surface of the railroad. And what we can do now is to take a cloth, and if there's any excess glue, we can come in here and we can just wipe it up. Now I've put some ballast in this spoon, and I'm going to come in here and sprinkle some of the ballast into the tunnel portal. And I'm only going to put it down about as far as I can see. Put a little on each side. All right, that looks pretty good. Take our brush and we'll smooth it out. Come in here and just lay out a little, get it nice and smooth. And what you want to do, you want to get it pretty much perfect before you apply the glue, because after you apply the glue you can't work it anymore. You just have to leave it and let it dry. Now I'm going to wet the ballast down with a fine spray of water, just enough to moisten it. So now we take our little dispenser. The glue is soaked into the ballast, and capillary action has pulled it out to the edges so that every place we put stone now has glue and stone in it. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention ballasting track in other scales and gauges. Here's a small section of my HO layout with the flex track already installed. I've painted the rail and ties using flow quill paint pens, and then dry brushed the tops of the ties with a little antique white. Then I spread Woodland Scenic's medium B80 buff HO ballast using the soft rubber applicator. Because this ballast is very fine, it needs a strong wetting agent. I soaked the ballast with rubbing alcohol and applied the scenic cement using the accordion applicator. While the glue is still wet, I weathered the ballast by applying a wash of Micromax Age It Easy. It gives a nice weathered black effect. Now we've put the tunnel liner in place. It's not much. It's just a piece of corrugated cardboard that has some brick paper glued to it, and then some black paint from a spray can and with a brush, and I just darkened areas that I didn't want the viewer to see, especially up in the overhead and down at the far end of the tunnel liner. So tunnel liners can be as complicated or as simple as you'd like. Now it's time to cover our mountain with plaster cloth, and the plaster cloth we're using here today is Micromax plaster cloth. This is a very, very good product, and as you can see from one roll, there's way more than we need here. In fact, I'm going to cover the mountain with 2 layers of plaster cloth. I've also covered the track with some blue tape. This is blue painter's tape, same stuff you buy in a hardware store, and it's very good on track because when you remove it later on, after you've done your scenery, it doesn't leave any residue. Okay, let's put some plaster cloth on our mountain, and it's very simple to use. You take a sheet, you dip it in water, let it drain a second, and then lay it on your mountain. I try to overlap these pieces about a third, maybe a little less, and in areas where I know that visitors will be leaning on the railroad, or where I'm going to apply a lot of rock castings, I'll put 2 layers 2 complete layers of plaster cloth. As you can see, this goes along very, very fast. There's not much to it. You just lay them on, and you can see the reason why I suggested that the spacing be about the size of your hand, maybe a little smaller. Now, there's no rhyme or reason to this. You can work from top to bottom or bottom to top, whatever suits you. After the plaster sets, of course, it's just going to be one big eggshell. So you can apply this stuff any way you like. I'm putting a little teeny back on my mountain, just a few pieces, and all of these are going to do is add some extra strength to my mountain here. Now I'm going to add one more piece to the front. I'm going to put some rocks in here, so that's why I want the plaster cloth to cover all the way down to the railroad. So here's our mountain. Now the next step is to go away for 20 or 30 minutes and allow the plaster to set. Another way to build landforms is with sheet styrofoam. Styrofoam landforms are easy to build and they're easy to change. Foam scenery will stand up to a lot of rough handling, so it's perfect for modular layouts or a layout that's going to be moved. It's lightweight, dimensionally stable, and almost indestructible. It's easy to carve and shape and accepts all kinds of scenery techniques, especially my water-soluble method of building scenery. The only downside of styrofoam is that it's a little more expensive than cardboard strips and plaster cloth techniques. For this demonstration, I'll be using 1-inch thick and 2-inch thick sheets of the pink and blue styrofoam. It can be pink or blue, it doesn't make any difference, it just depends on who manufactured it. Different thicknesses are available depending on how cold it gets where you live, so you may see sheets up to 4 inches thick. You know, to hold the foam pieces together, I like liquid nails for projects. This is liquid nails for projects. This is styrofoam compatible and has enough tack to hold the pieces together so they can be positioned if needed. It's dispensed from a caulking gun, like this one. Here's some in a caulking gun. And all you do is put a bead of liquid nails on a piece of foam, kind of push the pieces together, weight them down, and let them sit overnight. And you'll have a bond that's almost permanent. Next, you'll need a way to cut and shape the sheets of foam. Here are one of the tools I use. The first tool is this handy foam cutting knife. This knife is used for cutting large sheets, large pieces, and for removing large areas of foam. Another tool I like, this is for smaller cuts. This is a mat knife. This one here is a pretty fancy one, but you can find a mat knife from $2 to $20 depending on what you buy. I like this one because it has a retractable blade and also because I can put the blade out to a full 2 inches and cut through a whole sheet of foam. I'm going to show you some of the tools that I use every day to cut foam with. The first one is this hot wire foam factory, and this consists of a power supply, which you see here, which has an on and off switch, and you turn it to turn it on and off, and you can adjust it for the best heat depending on what you're cutting. The other item is this wand or yoke or cutting device, which looks something like a slingshot. It has an on and off switch on the front of it, and it has a piece of nichrome wire right here, which is the cutting part of it. And all you do with this is just run it through the foam. It cuts it very nicely. It gives you a nice clean cut. There are no pieces of foam that get on your railroad. You only have the piece you cut off. Another tool I use all the time is this Crafter's heavy duty hot knife. This is a real substantial tool for cutting foam, especially big sheets of foam, and for cutting large hunks off of pieces of foam, off of foam mountains and such. And it consists of a heavy-duty pistol-style handle, a heat control knob on the top, and an on and off button. And to use it, all you do is hold down the red button on the top of the unit until the blade gets hot. There's a ceramic heating element inside this metal blade. And this is important. It takes a few minutes for it to heat up because it has to heat all of this metal. So you hold down the switch, you wait 10 or 15 seconds, and then the device will be hot enough to cut through a piece of foam. And you can see it cuts through the foam just like butter. Now, the device is sold with a safety guard, and if for some reason you don't like having this big hot blade out here in front of you, you can put the safety guard on, and here's a picture of the knife with the guard on it to show you how it looks. It also cuts down blade area on the knife by putting the guard on. The trick with this tool is to let the blade do the work. So that's the Crafter's heavy-duty hot knife. As you can see, I've taken foam, blue foam and pink foam. I've used the liquid nails, and I've stacked it up. This is the start of our mountain. This is the rough shape. Now I'm going to take the hot knife tool and the hot wire tool and some hand tools, and I'm going to shape this into a background mountain for this little layout. So let's get started. Well, that's about it for the large hot knife. Now I'm going to go to a smaller cutter, the Foam Factory hot wire tool. Now that I've got the little hill roughly shaped, I can refine the contours. One of the ways of doing it is with sandpaper. Just sand the surface down. Another one is to use a small serrated knife like this paring knife and just carve the contours down. This knife is very good because it's very sharp and it'll give you a smooth cut. Another way to shape the foam is with a Stanley Sureform tool. This is a rasp with a comfortable handle, and you can use it to smooth the foam out. Comes in several different varieties. Here's a smaller piece for getting into close areas. When I get the hill shaped like the way I want it, I like to seal the foam surface. There are 3 or more ways to do this. The first way is to paint the foam like you see here. The advantage is that now we have an instant contour, it's earth colored, and we're ready to add foliage or plant trees. A disadvantage is that the foam surface is porous. and it'll absorb a lot of paint. If you do decide to paint the foam, just remember it's going to take several days to dry. Another way to seal the surface is with joint compound. I've done this many times. I take the joint compound and I dilute it about half with water so that it's brushable. Then I take this wide brush, like you see here. You can even use a wallpaper brush if you have a lot of scenery. I pick up some of the joint compound and I brush it on the foam. Here is the joint compound mixed with water. As you can see, it has the consistency of heavy cream, and I'm just going to take this and just paint it on. It fills in all the pores of the foam and gives you a hard white surface that takes paint nicely and is easy to add scenery to. Well, here it is now all dry. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take some of my earth colored paint and I'm going to paint it. And you might say, well, it's not going to look any different than the foam that you just sealed up with just paint. But it does. It has a smoother surface, it's less porous, and the paint I'm putting on the area that I coated with the joint compound, this paint is going to dry very fast because it's like painting a wall. 20 minutes later you can give it a second coat. There are many ways to make good-looking rocks in your scenery. One of the simplest and easiest is to carve them from plaster. Today I have the pleasure of introducing you to Doug Foscali of Foscale Limited, the manufacturer of many fine craftsman kits. Doug is going to demonstrate his technique for making plaster rocks. Take it away, Doug.
By carving into plaster, we can get some unique rock shapes that we wouldn't be able to get with molds that would repeat within a scene. We're going to use this simple palette knife, create some rock shapes, and then carve further detail with a simple X-Acto knife. Let's get started. Okay, the first thing we need to do is outline the extent of where we're going to be working. So we can create some rock shapes beyond the portal here, and then we're going to draw this out a little further, just to give us an idea of where we're working. And we don't necessarily have to stick to that line, but it'll help us out a little bit. So we're going to take this 1-inch foam, and we're just going to start cutting with a serrated knife and sort of mass out the basic shapes. And eventually we'll glue them in place, but for now we'll just mock up some quick pieces. And what this will do is keep us from using more plaster than we need to. And one thing you want to do is avoid some 90-degree angles like I had there, just to make it more natural. So we're going to bevel an edge like this. Otherwise we'll have to make up for it with plaster, and we don't want to do that. So we'll just take down some of these edges. And with a glue gun we can start gluing these in place. And over here we could use some of this 2-inch foam to get a thicker mass. Now we're going to have this gap here, and we don't want to fill that with plaster, so we'll cut another piece, fill that in. Now we're going to continue the plaster inside the tunnel, so we're going to want something for it to grab to, so we'll cut a small piece. Okay, we have enough foam to start massing out our plaster, so we're going to mix some plaster. This is regular plaster of Paris that you could find in your hardware store, and we're using this because it's much easier to work with. It's very flexible. If you use other plasters, they're going to be very difficult to carve as they dry. And we're just mixing this per the instructions, but what you really want is a consistency that's sort of like peanut butter. You don't want anything too watery. So if you do, it'll slide down the slopes of your rocks, and you'll be adding more plaster than you need to. So we're only mixing whatever we can carve in 6 minutes. And we're using this flat palette knife to apply the plaster. And it's going to look like blobs at first. And you do want to put it on kind of thick, because what that allows for is carving out more material. Because if you just skim coated this, if you start carving into this, you'll eventually hit the plaster cloth. So to get some depth and undercuts and shadows, you put a little extra on than you would have if you were just skim coating across the hard shell. And you sort of work one while the other is setting up. And these curved blobs are exactly what you don't want. So as it sets up in a few minutes, we'll start to get rid of them. Okay, we're going to mix some more plaster while this sets up. Okay, this plaster you can see is starting to set up. So we're going to put some fresh plaster back here and let that get to drying, and then we can move on to carving what we've put down previously. So with our palette knife, we can start to flatten out these curved blob shapes. And you want to start to get an idea of what you're going for. And you're not necessarily creating a theme, but you want some understanding of how the rock got there in terms of form and shape. And over time, you know, they start out as flat layers often, but then they buckle and fold. So we sort of define one prominent line, and it could be at an angle, it could be straight, but we just use that as a starting point. So we just cut into it with our palette knife, and we're going to assume that this sediment was sort of had a tilt this way, and then after that they can break up. But this will be the basis for where we start. And then with the flat edge of the knife, we can further take down anything that looked like a plaster blob. And we could start making some smaller cuts parallel to the main cut. And again, these don't have to be precise. You don't need a ruler to do this, but they just need to be somewhat parallel. You know, one thing we need to do as we work is see the work. So to do that, we can use a China brush like this. These are very inexpensive. And just brush away the excess material. But the other benefit of using this brush is it starts to soften the edges. Since the plaster's still kind of wet, it basically creates its own form of erosion, as you know, just how rocks are in nature. So it's a really good trick. So you start with this major crack, and then we have these sort of secondary cracks. And within the secondary cracks, we can start to break up these layers. So this is the layer of sediment over time. You know, you have 1, 2, and 3 here. We can break those since they've been settling and falling. And just like avoiding this crisscross grid, you don't want to create a pattern that looks like bricks. So you have to be kind of random. And then you can also make undercuts. Now these undercuts would occur over time, of course, from the folding and cracking, but they also occur from water settling in one spot. And then through seasons, through ice and thaws, they break up even further. So you can kind of give some history to your rock work, and it helps guide you as to why you're making these cuts and lines. And a lot of times a layer like this might crack this way, and you can have it settled, look like it's settled a bit. So make a defining crack across, and then to drop this level, you just carve away, starting at the crack. And now we have this shift vertically in the surface, and now it looks like this went down, or this could have gone up, but adds a little bit more interest. So now we have these major cracks and major segments, and these sort of secondary cracks. Eventually, as it dries, which it has already, it's starting to set up quickly, we can make some minor cracks. And these are hairline fractures. And you're literally, there's hardly any weight in the knife, and you're just drawing them across the surface. Now, you don't want too much of a spider effect, like broken glass. Just a few here and there. And what that does is create a sense of scale. Okay, we're throwing down more plaster where we left off. And you want to carry this over to your dried area a little bit, just so we can, once it's dry, we can blend it in a little bit, and you'll never notice the transition. And all of this is not necessarily going to be a rock face. In this small area here, dirt would probably settle there, and you'd have some vegetation. So That'll be blended in later. And another benefit to carving your own rocks is that you could use a photograph and replicate an actual site and get it as close to as possible just by massing out similar shapes that you'd see in the photograph. And that's something that's probably a little bit more difficult to do if you're using rock molds. So now we're going to go back to our line here and reuse that as a guide to where we can go. We're just going to flatten this area out and assume this sediment went this way and sort of bent a bit and took to the curve of this mountain here. So while this section sets, we'll add more plaster over here. And you can see that it's a very quick process, and it's only as long as it takes for plaster to dry. So when you first think about carving something, you might think in your head that it'll take a long time, but it doesn't. And if you're unhappy with some areas that you've worked on, it's very simple to quickly mix some more plaster, cover it up, and start over. Now we're going to make another defining cut here, carry it up. Now we can carry it straight through like this, but like we lowered the other areas previously, this way we can change a different direction, and instead of putting the seam in line, we can move it over. And then we're going to use this line again to make yet another shift in the rock surface. I'm going to carve in, and this is why we add a lot of plaster, so we could remove a good amount. Up here, it's about 1/4 of an inch deep now, this cut. If you're planning to create some debris at the bottom, you could also save the bigger pieces and just keep them in a cup, and we could color them later and then sprinkle them at the bottom so it looks like a talus. Okay, now we've taped the inside of the tunnel lining here to protect the stone surface that we placed earlier. And this way we don't have to worry about getting plaster on it, but we do want to blend it in just enough to cover the edge and the seam. Now, since the portal was blasted out, it should look a little different from this kind of rock because it wasn't there naturally. So we're going to try to make it look a little bit different. And one of the ways we could do that is carve some horizontal lines where drilling took place and explosives were put in to make the opening. So if this were blasted out, most likely they would drill in from this way. So we could use that as a guide for where our parallel lines will go. And you can just make them as parallel as possible. And just by brushing over those lines is enough to give it a sense of erosion and wear since they were put there. And you can see by this work that we've done, it's pretty seamless, and it might be a little more difficult to do if you used rock molds because you'd have to stop and start with sections and hope they blended in properly. Then we have a line here that we placed earlier, and we want to add some plaster under that line because it would be difficult for dirt and vegetation to just sit there. So this would definitely be a rock face. Now, one thing you want to make sure you do is check your clearance when you're carving and adding plaster to your portal. So you could use a ON30 track gauge here, and you can see we're a little over on this side. So all you need to do is just carve away just a little bit, and you'll have enough clearance. Now we took some material away, and we're going to check again to see if we're clear. And we're very close, so that's going to work for us. Okay, now we've come to a point where we want to see how our carvings paid off. And the best way to do that is to apply the wash that we're going to apply to color it. So this is Age It Easy, Railroad Tie and Bridge Stain, and it's a gray-brown wash. And what it's going to do is not only color our rocks, it's going to tell us if we need to carve any more. So it's a good way to get a read on whether you've carved enough. because once you apply it, you'll be able to see details that you haven't seen before, like all the hairline cracks start to come out. And as you could leave these rocks as is with just this wash, but we're going to do a couple other things after this to add a little more depth. And you can apply just one coat if you want, but if you want a little darker, just keep applying more. Okay, the next step after we've stained our rock is to dry brush it with white paint. And we're going to use white acrylic paint like Polyscale Reefer White. And when we dry brush, we're taking as much paint off the brush as possible. And we're just going to drag it across the rock surface. And you can see how it highlights the edges, and you're not actually painting the rock, you're barely scraping the surface. And this is yet another layer that helps bring out the details that you've gone through all the trouble to carve. And it's a very subtle effect, so you don't need to use very much and you don't need to apply very much. Okay, now we could leave the white dry brushing as is, but we want to add another layer to get as much contrast and tonal change as possible. So we're taking Polyscale Earth and dry brushing it right on top of the white. And this doesn't have to be everywhere. We just want a little hint of a different color. And when you're making your rock work to a specific geographic region, you might want to do a little research and see what colors are used in the rock in that area. Now sometimes the color you put down after the white might appear a little strong. And what you could do is just go back over the white. And what you're doing is just fading that color a little bit and blending it in even further. So you could go back and forth with colors as often as you want until you get the look that you're looking for. Okay, now our next layer of weathering is going to be through these weathering powders. And they come in a lot of colors, but we're going to sort of stick to the colors that we've used in our rock so far, which is dry brushing the white, the brown, and then we're going to use black, but very, very little, probably hardly any at all. So we're going to use a wide fan brush, and these powders go a long way, so always start with the smallest amount possible. And where you're looking to apply them are in the undercuts, because what you're doing with the powder is creating a shadow. And these are Doc O'Brien's weathering powders, and in addition to the colors you see here, there are plenty of weathering colors and colors you could use for weathering freight cars and other things in the same way. And just like the dry brushing, if you put on too much, you can take some white and just a very little bit and just blend it in. What you don't want is to look like it was brushed on, and the more you brush it, the more it'll soften up and blend into the cracks and so forth. The best thing to do is just do this for a few moments and then stop, because if you go a little further, you're probably end up using too much. And take a look, step back and take a look and see where you are.
When it came time for me to come in here and check Doug's clearances, I found I couldn't get my fat fingers around the micro mark clearance gauge. So what I did, I drilled a little hole in the middle of it and took a 1/4-20 bolt and a couple of nuts and made a handle for it. And now I can stand back and check my clearance into the tunnel portal here. Now that Doug has finished his rock carving and colored them and made these beautiful rocks, I would like to seal the plaster cloth. There are several ways to do this. One of them is not sealing it, just painting it, putting some vegetation on it and forgetting about it. And it's okay, it's a system that works. Doug could have taken his plaster Paris, troweled it over the plaster cloth, brushed it out smooth, and we could have had a nice white background. And it would have given it a lot of strength. The way I like is to use sculptor mold. Sculptor mold is a clay-based product. It's made for the craft industry, but I like it because it mixes with water It's easy to clean up, and it gives you a surface that has some natural texture, that is hard, it's durable, it's flexible, and when it dries, it's pretty lightweight. And what I like to do is just take it with a putty knife and just trowel it over the plaster cloth. Now, we don't need a lot of sculptor mold. We can get away with a thin coat because when it dries, it's very, very strong. All right, now I'm going to take a China bristle brush. You can see it here. And I'm just going to start by adding a little bit of texture just by pushing the brush into the sculptor mold. And what I'm doing is blending any edges together. This is very forgiving. And another good thing that I didn't mention, I've got about 20 minutes to work this stuff. So I'm in no hurry. I can get this perfect. That's it. I've got about 1/4 of an inch of sculptor mold all over the mountain. It looks pretty good. Now I'm going to go away and let the sculptor mold set, and when it does, this mountain will be just as hard as a rock. A little earlier, you saw me put the sculptor mold on our plaster cloth mountain, and I'm telling you, it's really rigid now. So what I'm doing, I'm taking earth-colored paint. You could use polyscale earth or any other kind of earth paint that you like. This is just, for this part of the scenery, I'm just using flat indoor wall paint that's earth colored, and I'm painting the ground area. And what I'm trying to do here is blend what I'm doing into Doug's rock. So every once in a while you'll see me take this little brush and just kind of brush this paint over the rock coloring that Doug did. And all I'm doing is bringing the color of the soil down into the rocks a little bit. And there's going to be a lot of greenery put on this. There'll be a lot of vegetation around. So what we're doing now may be covered up with vines and grass and stuff, but it's a good way to blend the two together. So I'm going to keep going. I'm going to cover the hill with earth paint, and then when it dries, we're going to add the foliage to it. You know, there's another way to make really nice looking rocks on your model railroad, and that's to use plaster rock castings. Here are some examples here. They're made in rubber or latex molds. Here's an example of a mold here. And Woodland Scenics sells a line of molds. There are hobby shops that have their own brands, and you can buy rock molds online. So what I like to do is to make a lot of little tiles. By a little tile, I mean I took a rock mold and I didn't fill it. I filled it about 1/3, or maybe even less than that, to make this little teeny piece of rock that's got all of this detail on the surface, and it has a very thin profile. And what I like to do is to apply these rocks, first of all, art direct them, arrange them in the way I want to see them, and then apply them as if I was applying tile. So I use sculptor mold as a grout, I trowel it on, and then I press the rock castings into the sculptor mold and leave them. The sculptor mold acts like cement. It holds the castings in place, and then when it all dries, I'll come back and paint it, and I'll show you how I'm going to do that. What I've done here, I've mixed up some sculptor mold like we did when we mixed it up for the mountain that was made out of plaster cloth. I've mixed it up. It's just, there's no proportion with sculptor mold. You can follow the directions on the package. I just mix in enough water so that it works nicely. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take these castings and I'm going to embed them in the sculptor mold. And let's start right here on the end. I'm going to have this rock face be right here. So the first thing I'm going to do is apply sculptor mold directly over my scenery base. And you can see we don't have to be real neat with this. We do need a bit of it on there just so that it acts as a bedding agent for the casting. Now, these rock castings that I'm going to put on here, I made yesterday, and I made them out of hydrocal. They're still pretty damp. They still have a lot of water content in them. But one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to spray the casting with water, just plain tap water, to wet it. Because when I push this in place here, I don't want the casting sucking all the moisture out of the sculptor mold, because the sculptor mold won't set properly. So here's our first rock in place. So now I take a wet brush and I just dab the sculptor mold around the rock casting so that it blends it in place. As you can see, this is a very easy and a very controllable process. Now we're going to put in this second rock casting, and I want it as close to the first one as possible. I want it right up in here. So what I'm going to do is trowel on more sculptor mold. Okay, and we're going to take our casting like we did before, and we're going to wet it, and then I'm going to just push it into place. All right, now that I have these two castings in place, and they look really nice here, I'm going to continue along. I'm going to place this one next. No, maybe I'll do this one. And if the castings aren't the right shape, don't be afraid to take a pair of pliers and break off any areas to make the bottom smooth or to make them fit better. Because we can use almost every piece we break off. We can add this piece up in here between these two. So I'm going to keep going and finish this rock face along here by the track. So here's our little rock face. I'm going to continue it as soon as I make some more rock castings. I used all of the castings I made yesterday, so I'll make some more, and then I'll finish this rock face down the length of our little hill here. And you can see how nice these castings blend into the sculptor mold. Now it's time to paint them. And the painting technique I'm going to use on these is different than the technique that Doug shows you that he likes. My technique is more about painting than staining. So I'm going to start with a color that I call scenery black. Scenery black is a mix of flat black and 2 parts earth. So what you get is a warm gray. And I paint the rocks with this warm gray color. And this is a base color. And what I'm doing really with this color is adding a primer coat to the scenery, and I'm sealing and filling in all of the shadows in the rock face. Now I've got my little hill here all built. I've got all the plastic castings in place, and now I've put on a coat of scenery black. That's 2 parts earth to 1 part flat black. It's painted over the rocks. I'm going to allow that to dry, and then I'm going to paint the rocks with 4 colors of polyscale paint. We're going to use rust, railroad tie brown, concrete, and sand. And these 4 colors you can duplicate almost any rock colors. We're also going to use reefer white at the end to dry brush the rocks. You'll also need a plastic container lid. This is going to be our palette, an inexpensive China bristle brush, and a pad of paper towel here to clean most of the paint off the brush with. I've put about a teaspoon of each color in the lid, and I'm going to start by mixing railroad tie brown, rust, and a little concrete to make a reddish gray rock color. As you can see, this is not a lot brighter than the scenery black paint that I've put on here. Now you notice I'm not brushing the paint on. I'm just dabbing it on with the tip of the brush. Come back here. And you can see this is a very forgiving process. If you want the rocks to be a little redder, then take some of the sand and some of the rust and make yourself a pinker color. And you see we can put this right on. You can put it on as just a band of color, especially if you're modeling the Southwest and there's a lot of layers of color, layers of sand. We could add a sedimentary layer. This may look a little too bright to you, so go back in and just brush it down. And by brushing it down, I mean you take the brush and just push on it to spread it out a little bit to kind of diminish the intensity. Okay, so we've added some colors to this. We've lightened it up a little bit. Now I'm going to take the dirt and the concrete together to make a light gray color, which is going to be the basic rock color. And essentially what it is, it's a color that's similar to the earth color that we put up here on the rocks. Now we're going to take this area, this is on top, and then we're going to make this just a little bit lighter. So we're going to take a little bit of the concrete and a little bit of the sand, and we're just going to brush this up here just to lighten it up. What I'm looking for really up here is a color that's similar to the earth color we put on. And we can make that color just by taking a little bit of the sand and a little bit of the rust and adding it up here. Oops, a little too rusty. And down to this area. More of the same. Pick up some of the rail tie brown, some of the earth. Now it's almost impossible to duplicate the colors that you created on the first rocks that you painted, but you can get pretty close. And the variety of color of the rocks is really important. The variety of color is what makes them look realistic. Now you get the hang of it pretty much. That's about all there is to it, except when we finish them with dry brushing. I should start by saying that the brush itself should be dry when you start. You don't want any moisture on the brush because it'll make the dry brushing smear on the rock surface. What I've done, I've taken some reefer white. You don't have to use reefer white. You can use any white acrylic paint. You can use craft store paints if you like. I've put some on this brush. So I'm going to start by I'll put a little bit of white just on the top surfaces of these rocks. And I'm brushing top to bottom, the way light would fall on the rock. And depending on the kind of paint you use, as I said, you can use any kind of white acrylic paint for this. If you use tube acrylics, they tend to be very sticky. So what you get another texture as you drag the brush across the surface of the rock casting, because the texture of the paint tends to stick to the surface of the castings. You can see how this technique brings out all the detail in the rock surface. And there's a lot of detail you'd never see if you just painted the rocks and didn't dry brush them. So that's my technique for installing rock castings and then painting them. In this short segment, I'm going to talk about finishing the landforms. And mainly here on this display, it's just about covering up the remaining pink foam. And I'm going to put some sculptor mold on these riverbanks. I'm going to sculpt them with my trusty China bristle brush, and then we'll paint them up so that they look realistic. As soon as the riverbanks are in, then we can model the water. So let's get started. We're going to start in this section right here, right next to our little abutment. And I've got sculptor mold, I've got it mixed up. It's pretty stiff. And I'm going to start by just troweling it on, just like we did when we were covering up the plaster cloth. I'm putting on about maybe 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch of material. We don't need a lot. I'm going to take the brush and we're going to add an effect that looks like erosion. Here's my brush. We're going to start by pushing the brush into the sculptor mold, pushing it all together. What I'm looking for is just areas of texture in the sculptor mold, and you can kind of push it aside so that you can make something that looks like water has run off the surface up here and down into the river. Also part of the finishing process here is to add just a contour to get our hill and back here, which was made on pink foam, to kind of blend in with the foreground. And all I'm doing is putting a fillet of sculptor mold in here. We're not going to put any rock formations or anything on it. We're just going to kind of blend it in and make it look like it's just part of the landscape here. Take my trusty brush, and now we can blend it all together. I'm not looking for a lot of texture here because this is all going to be covered with foliage, so all I'm doing is just creating a shape that blends one landform in with another. Here's our little hill, all ready for some greenery. I put earth-colored paint over the sculptor mold, and I sprinkled a little fine sand into the paint. And then I took our 4 colors and I painted the riverbanks and kept painting all the way up to meet up with Doug's rocks. I also took the river base and primed it with a little bit of blue and a little bit of black. In this section, I'm going to talk a little about building water. Some of you may already know a lot about building water because you bought my DVD called Building Waterways on Your Model Railroad. And if you want more information about building waterways, I'd suggest that you buy the DVD. But on this display, I'm going to show you the basics of building water. And we're going to use some blue, black, and green acrylic paint. You can use polyscale paints for this, or you can use craft store acrylics. Use any paint you like. The colors are kind of important. Black, blue. I favor something that's close to cerulean blue, and any medium green will work. To make the water, we're going to use Woodland Scenic's Realistic Water and Woodland Scenic's Water Effects. There are a lot of other materials available to use, a lot of things on the market. I'd suggest that you try these first and then try some other products. So let's get started. I've primed this waterway with a little bit of black with some blue mixed in it. And all I wanted to do was seal the base. And I'm going to start again with my China bristle brush, some black, some blue mixed on our little palette. And I'm going to start by just dabbing in some color. Now, because I primed this, there's a good coating of color already on here. So all I'm doing now is just adding the reflection that you'd see if you're standing out in nature and looking at a body of water. You're going to see the sky reflected in it. And if the sky is blue, then you're going to see some blue reflecting in the water. There's no art ability required to do this. Just pick up a little bit of blue, a little bit of green, a tiny bit of black on the tip of your brush, and just start to apply it. Now, I use the brush in a stabbing motion, and I'm doing that so that I don't leave brush marks. The effect you're trying for here is, of course, to blend the colors together right on the surface of the water, and that's why I'm using the tip of the brush, and I'm just kind of pushing them together. Now you have to be careful around the bridge abutments. This bridge is already set in place here, and it's glued into the water base. So what I need to do for the bridge is take a small brush and work around the edges. Now, underneath the bridge, you can almost get away with using pure black because the bridge is going to cast a shadow on the water. There's going to be no sky reflection in the water. There's just going to be the shadow of the bridge. Now we're going to come back with a larger brush, and I'm going to continue the foreground here. Now, the nice thing about this is just paint. And if you don't like it, you can come right back in here and paint over it and keep painting it until it looks good. I'm adding a little more blue right in the middle here just to show some current activity, some moving water, just another color. All right, now we'll go away and allow it to dry. Now that we've got the water base painted in and it's almost dry here, I'm going to continue with the scenic texture, before I apply the finishing coat of water. The realistic water should be the last thing you put on your model railroad. So we're going to put all of the greenery on this part of the railroad now. Everything around the water we're going to texture, and then when the texture is dry and in place, we're going to come back and add the water. So let's get going. Now it's time to detail under the rocks, and I'm going to do that by adding some talus, some loose rock underneath these rocks so that it will look like, due to freezing and thawing, that rocks have broken off and have landed underneath here. It's also, for the railroad track in the foreground, it's also an area that may have been blasted, and the rock from the blasting was just pushed aside to make way for the train. This is Woodland Scenic's talus. Comes in many different sizes. I'm using these size, which are a little smaller than a pea. And I'm also going to be using some of the rocks that we saved from when Doug Fiscali carved his rock face. And these are plaster scraps that are left over from when Doug was here. Let's prepare the base. And I prepare the base the same way for everything I build. I put down dilute white glue. This is Elmer's white glue, and it's been diluted half with water. And this is going to be the base adhesive. I don't know what else to call it. This is going to be the stuff that's going to anchor our stones in place while we add the rest of them. So we can use a liberal portion of white glue here, and I'm going to brush it right up to the edge of the track. Now I'm going to take some of the Woodland Scenic's talus, and I'm just going to sprinkle it along here. Now you can take the brush and you can push some of it around even while the glue is wet here. And what I'm doing, I'm pushing it up underneath the little overhangs of rock. And once you get it where you like it, then we're going to add some of the rock scraps. This is a different color of rock that we're going to add. This is a different kind of rock, but all of this rock work here will be dry brushed later on. It'll kind of blend it all together. I'm going to take some dirt from the yard and just sprinkle it in here, and it'll sit right in the glue, and the glue will anchor it. In fact, I'm going to sprinkle it right up against the track. And now the last step is to take more glue, and this time I'm using the Woodland Scenic's Scenic Cement, and I'm going to take it in a little cup and pick it up with the applicator here, and I'm just going to sprinkle it on over all of the rock work. And as we did when we ballasted the track, I want this to look white throughout. It's going to dry clear, but I want to make sure there's enough top adhesive on it to hold everything in place. One more thing we can do here, I'm going to take some Woodland Scenic's blended turf, and I'm going to take a little in my fingers, and I'm just going to sprinkle it on here and there just to add some initial greenery. Well, some of it is covering the rocks. I don't care about that, because I may, after the glue dries, come in here and dry brush the tops of the rocks up. So here's our little talus pile. I'm going to go ahead now, let the glue dry, and as soon as it's dry, I'll show you what it looks like. While this is drying, I'm going to add some greenery to the top of the hill here. We're going to do it exactly the same way as we did with the talus pile in the foreground here. I'm going to take some dilute white glue and put a little on here. I don't want it to run down into the rocks, but if it does, it does. All right, I'm going to start by sprinkling on some blended turf and just sprinkle it into the wet glue. Now you need a texture to start with, so it'll give the slopes here of the hill some tooth so that we can add gravel and other things as we go along. Now the next step here is to add a little bit of sand into the wet glue and As you can see, I'm just sprinkling on a little bit. And what I'm hoping for is that some of the sand will come down in the tops of the rocks. The rocks have natural places where dirt and sand and grass would collect. In fact, I'm going to put a little bit of scenic foam right on top of the rocks, just in the spots that would naturally collect them in nature. Now when I have everything the way I like it, I'm going to wet this all down with wet water. And what the wet water is going to do, it's going to hold everything in place. Now we've wet everything down, now we're going to take the scenic sprayer, and this time it has Woodland Scenic cement in it, and we're just going to spray this over the surface, right over the tops of the rocks, because this stuff dries flat. In fact, it disappears when it dries, so you don't have to worry about getting the scenic cement on the rocks you just painted. And now we can go back and sprinkle on a little more scenic foam now that we have a place for it to stick to. Okay, we're going to go away and let this dry, and then we'll come back and check it out. Okay, we're going to finish the rest of the scenery here, and as you can see, we're using the same method for finishing this section of the scenery as we used on the other part of the scenery that I showed you earlier. There are 2 layers of glue. I put down dilute white glue on the bottom. I sprinkle a texture into it, could be sand or scenic foam or both. And what that does, it provides some tooth for the textures that come over it. And if you put a large layer of texture on, you may have to spray the area with wet water and then spray it with scenic cement. That's the top adhesive. So our bottom adhesive is dilute white glue. We put our textures over the dilute white glue, we wet it down with wet water, and then we add the scenic cement on top of everything. And the glue sandwich will dry and hold everything in place. So this is what we're doing to the whole display here. And I'm going to finish putting down all the greenery, and then the next step, of course, is to add the trees and shrubs. You know, in the foreground here, I added a short road, and I wanted to put a road in just so that there would be some way, some visible way, to get to the little structure that I'm going to put behind the track. So my road is just a piece of thin styrene, and you could use poster board or mat board or even basswood. It's cut to fit the contour of the track. It's put in with liquid nails glued to the styrofoam, and then I filled in around it with sculptor mold. I did the same on the other side of the track, and when the sculptor mold dried, I added scenery around the edges, sand on top of the road, and then I oversprayed everything with scenic cement, and I'm going to go away and let it all dry, and when it's dry, then we're going to come back and finish the scene. So we have a road here covered with very fine sand, and it's all glued in place nicely. Now I'm going to cover it with earth-colored paint, just so that it becomes the same color as the rest of the scenery. And you may wonder about the edges. There are some really hard edges here. And to solve that problem, I'm going to use a sprayer, and I'm just going to spray it along the edge so that the earth-colored paint can kind of leak into or flow into the surrounding scenery. I'll do it on the forward road here so you can see it close up. We've got the paint, and we're just going to run it down the road. When the paint dries, of course, we'll weather it a little bit. We'll put on some grease stains and some tire marks and things like that. And we can do that with the Doc O'Brien's weathering powders. So here's our foreground road all painted. Now we take the water, the spray bottle, and just spray the edge of the road here. You know, one of the most effective ways to add detail to your scenery is with small shrubs, weeds, and small trees. And the easiest shrubs to use are those foliage clumps and clusters from Woodland Scenics. Here are some here. These are already manufactured, already made. They also are sold as foliage clusters. and as plump foliage. What these products are green scenic foam that have been glued together somehow. But their natural shape, as you can see here, is perfect for just gluing in place and making small trees and shrubs. And what I do, I put down dilute white glue and lay the foliage clusters or clumps into the white glue and then overspray it with scenic cement. Another way to add several types of texture is with Micromark's black polyfiber. The polyfiber is similar to acrylic pillow stuffing in cotton balls. It has a soft, hair-like quality, and it can be pulled and stretched into a variety of textures. In fact, one of the best ways to use black polyfiber is to make small background tree balls with it. Here are some here I made ahead of time. Years ago, I needed a non-organic substitute for lichen, and I came up with this method using polyfiber. So what you do, you take some of the black polyfiber and you fluff it up a little bit so you get like a little ball. This is scenic cement here, and you could put some in a little bowl and do this on a smaller scale. So you take the black polyfiber, you dip it in the scenic cement, wring it out as best you can, and then put it in a bag of scenic foam. Shake it around and pull it out. And here's the ball we just made right here. So you set it on a piece of newspaper, allow it to dry, and then the next day you have some wonderful little background trees. I have some white glue in this little cup, and it's diluted 1:1, and all I'm going to do is take my tree balls, dip them in the glue, and set them in place in the scenery. And you can see how nice they look set in place. And the interesting thing about these is the more you put in, the better it looks. And if you've got a vertical surface and you want to put a tree ball in, just take a pin or a nail, finished nail is good, and just stick it through the ball into the scenery, and it'll hold it in place. So all of our background is going to be covered here with tree balls, and I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I'll show you how it looks when we're done. To make undergrowth, I stretch the fiber as thin as possible without tearing it. Then I tear off a piece of the stretched fiber, about the size of the palm of my hand, and place the fiber on the scenery, pat it in place, and then I mist it with the scenic cement, or you could use hairspray, and then sprinkle on fine scenic textures, flowers, leaves, static grass, you know, whatever you want. But the thickness of the polyfiber gives you another dimension in your scenery, another texture, because it has height. You know, polyfiber can also be pulled apart and draped over rocks, bridge abutments, and any other place where you want lush hanging vines or ivy. What I do is spread a bead of white glue, full strength, at the top edge of a rock, and then put a piece of polyfiber into the white glue and hold it in place with my fingers, and then take the other end and pull down on it to stretch it out so that it becomes very, very thin. And then, again, you just spray it with scenic adhesive, sprinkle on any kind of foliage you want, and what you have is a nice hanging vine. Whenever I'm out and about, I'm always on the lookout for weeds that look like trees. And here's a couple here I picked right in my backyard here this winter. These are little bushes, and I cut the tips off them, and they're pretty much tree-shaped. So how I handle these is I dip them in the scenic cement, and then I just dip them in the scenic foam. Shake them around, pull them out, shake off the excess, and I have an instant tree. A few that I made earlier. Let me put that one right in there. And we'll do this again. We have the weed, dip it in a little scenic cement, put it in the scenic foam, and you can make a tree almost as fast as you can move. Now say you got a weed that's a funny shape. This one happens to be a pretty good shape, but say you got one that's a funny shape, or you want to make a special shape of a tree. That's where black polyfiber comes in handy. And here's some polyfiber. You just pull it out real thin, and then you can wrap the tree armature with it. Areas that you want to build up, you just add more polyfiber to it. And of course the color black is really handy because it looks like you are looking into the middle of a tree where it's very dark. So here's our polyfiber on the tree. We're going to take a little scenic cement, and I'm just going to wet down the polyfiber, shake off the excess, put it in the foam, and I'm not going to shake it around. I'm just going to kind of roll it and let the foam stick to the fiber. And here's some that came off, and that's easy to fix just by pushing it back into place. So here's our little tree made from a weed wrapped in black polyfiber and then covered with scenic cement and scenic foam. I want to take a minute during this part of the tape to show you how to deal with Woodland Scenic's field grass. I'm going to show you the method that I use and prefer for handling this stuff. What I like to do is work over a sheet of newspaper. Now this stuff is 1,000,000 fibers, as you can see. So what I do with it, I spread it out as thin as I can get it. And you can take your time doing this because, you know, it's all about getting them pulled out pretty thin. Now what we're going to do once we get them all spread out, that's pretty good right there. I'm going to take hairspray. This stuff was the cheapest super hold hairspray they had in the department store, and I'm just going to spray the Woodland Scenic's field grass until it's soaked. And you'll know that because it'll be glistening. I'm going to allow this to dry, and when it dries, the hairspray is going to hold all these fibers together. So then I'm going to run a piece of cardboard underneath it to get the whole piece up. I'm going to flip it over, and then I'm going to spray it again on the other side. And then after it dries, then you can handle it. You can cut pieces out of it, you can turn it, you can lay it in glue, and it'll all stay together. Here's our Woodland Scenic's field grass. As you can see, it's all stuck together in one piece now. Now we can take the scissors and we can come in here and we can cut off a section of field grass. As you can see, here's a piece I just cut off. And all you got to do is you can roll this, dip it in glue and plant it, which we'll do on our display here. Or you can make a hedgerow with it. You can stand it up in some glue like this, maybe make a cornfield or some sugarcane plants. And we still have this whole sheet here that we can use. We can cut it in half, we can use the pieces full length, we can use short sections of it. There's a million things you can do with this.
Hi, I'm Hal Reynolds, and I'm going to show you today how to use Micromox wire twisting pliers to make wire trees. I've gathered here the components that we're going to need to work with today. These are the wire twisting pliers. We have 2.5-inch bristles. We also have Micromox wire. We have a number of glues that we can use. This is a fabric glue. You can get it at Michael's or Joann's Fabrics. These two, this is canopy cement. Both of these are PVA glues. White glues will work just fine. We also have ground foam that we're going to use. We're also going to use some spray glue. This is Elmer's spray glue. And finally, we'll use some regular hairspray to seal the tree after we've got the foam applied. Ripped off a piece of wax paper, which we're going to use as a base to work on. It's regular wax paper that you would have in the kitchen. What we're going to do next is I'm going to put down a piece of wire. going to apply some glue to it. I'm using a fabric adhesive, although the canopy cement or the PVA white glue will work equally as well, whatever happens to be your preference. And now I'm going to lay some bristles down across the wire and the glue, trying to get them approximately centered. And you can make the tree as tall as you want by obviously applying more glue on the wire. You can also make a long wire and then cut it to make several trees, smaller trees, depending on the scale you're working on. So now at this point what we're going to do is we're going to take a second wire and we're going to apply a bead of glue down this as well too. The idea here is to sandwich the bristles between the two wires. I'm also trying to make sure that I line the ends of the wires up with each other. And what you want to do is you want to let it sit just a little bit, just so that the bristles don't fall out when we pick the wire up. Now that we've let the glue set up a little bit, we can see we have our bristles between our two wires. And what we're going to do next is we're going to use the wire twisting pliers. There's a catch lock mechanism here which allows you to open and close and lock the jaws into place. And what we're going to do is we're going to pinch the end of the wire, squeeze them shut, slide the chrome latch back to lock the wire, and then we'll pull on this knob which will make the pliers spin. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to take our wires and we're going to lock the pliers onto the end. Get them in the vise and the jaws here. Squeeze the handle, slide the chrome locking mechanism back. Now we're going to go to our bench vise and we're going to secure the opposite end into the vise and tighten the vise up. And now we'll start to pull. And there's a ratchet in the handle, but you still need to hold the tip of the pliers so that it doesn't back off on you, so that you can keep going. The other thing that you need to be aware of is you need to not over twist it, because if you over twist it too much, you break the wire. Done. That looks pretty good. The key is that the bristles don't pull out, but the glue helps us in that department as well too. So there we go. We have our tree ready for the next step. I'm going to release the plier. The next step is going to be to trim the tree, but first we need to snip off the end of the wire where it was clamped in the vise. I'm going to trim into a little box here. I'm just going to take our scissors and start snipping and rotating the tree as we go. Now you can, if you like, you can create a little interest in your tree by cutting into in certain places to open some areas up to create an irregular shape to the tree. I'm going to spray in the box so I don't get it all over the place. And now I'll sprinkle on some ground foam. Okay. And we tap off any excess that didn't stick. And at this point too, you can retrim if you feel like you need to trim a little more, if you don't like the particular look. Now I'm going to use hairspray, and you can use Krylon as well too, clear spray, to seal the foam in place. But you can also use this as an opportunity to add another texture or another color. This is Woodland Scenic's static grass, which looks like fine little pine needles, which I'll apply as a second layer on our tree here. And again, after I apply this, I will put another coat of hairspray on to seal it. And there you have it. Another interesting technique you can use the wire twisting pliers for is to make tall grass or weeds. And what we've got here is another armature, which have our bristles in that have been painted, a green with a light beige dusting on the tips. And what I'm doing here is I'm folding all of the bristles in one direction, sort of the opposite of what you want to do if you were trying to make a tree. But what this is going to wind up doing is creating a strip of grass. You twist it into some different shapes so that you don't have the row of grass, weeds, in a straight line. And then this can be glued down or stapled down to hold it temporarily while the glue dries. Here's a couple of other examples of other materials that you can use in the wire twisting pliers to create some interesting grass or ground cover effects. It's a great tool.
I want to talk a little about commercial trees, and here are a couple of examples. This is from Bachman. It's called Scenescapes, and what you get 3 really nice trees all ready to plant. Now you don't have to use them as is. You can do the same thing we did with the weed trees. You can spray these with a little scenic cement, sprinkle on other colors of green or brown scenic foam, and make them different colors. You can also take the scissors and come in here and make the shape irregular. And you can do a lot of things to change these trees and make them look better. As they sit right now, they'll be really good in the background of your model railroad. Another example are these deciduous trees from Scenescapes. And these are made on a plastic armature. They've been covered with polyfiber, sprayed with some kind of an adhesive, and then covered with foam. These can be used as is, or you can spray them with scenic cement and sprinkle on more foam. I always like to take these kind of trees and sprinkle on a lighter green foam from the top for the effect that sunlight is hitting the tops of the trees. In the next few minutes, we're going to take all of the things that we learned from this video and put them all together to build a little bit of scenery on our display. The first thing you'll notice is that I took the black backdrop down, and it was hiding a painted backdrop. I painted this for this display to be behind this display. I wanted to save the backdrop so that you could see it with scenery against it and see how nice it looks. Information on painting a backdrop like this can be found on my website at the end of this DVD. Building the water is always the last thing I do on a model railroad. I want to come in with the scenic foam and the glue and get everything down, allow it to dry, and then come back and vacuum up any of the loose pieces, especially in the waterway. Today we're going to use Woodland Scenic's Realistic Water, and you can see on the front edge of the display here I have a piece of blue tape, and this is just a safety factor. I'm going to pour this Realistic Water about 1/8 of an inch deep. I'm going to try my best for 1/8 of an inch. And that's how I have the tape situated, with about 1/8 of an inch above the front of the water. I'm going to put this in. I'm going to allow it to level itself Then I'm going to move around any areas in the edges that need a little coaxing. I'm going to do it with a toothpick, or in case a skewer. And we're going to go away and we're going to let it dry. And that's all you do to build realistic water. When it's dry, you can come back and you can put another layer on. But the second layer shouldn't exceed 1/8 of an inch. Now I'm going to take the prod here and I'm going to kind of move it around. I need a little bit more right here. I'm going to move it around with the skewer. I want to make sure I get it up to all the edges so that it kind of fills in. And then after it dries, I'll come back and remove the tape and we'll check it out. Well, you can see how easy it was to build water on our little display. I want to thank you all for watching. This is Dave Frary for the Trackside Modeler.